first, let me address the elephant in the room. I am not Stephen Freeland, and some of the people sitting before you on this stage are also not the people that are listed in either your program or on the website. So let's think of this as space mining, law, politics, perspectives, rebooted. My name is Diane Howard. I teach space law and policy at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in the Commercial Space Ops program. And I'm going to introduce all of our panelists to you in just a moment. To preface, we're going to talk about space mining. We're going to talk about the different perspectives on space mining. We've seen a rapid development of technology in the past couple of years. At one time, what seemed futuristic is now looking pretty tangible and feasible. And we're talking about the exploration and use of resources on celestial bodies. So, despite the considerable technical challenges that still confront these activities, there's a lot of interest. You see investors and businesses, you see scientists and engineers, and even politicians all getting into the mix on this. However, there are still some legal and political concerns, and they're emerging along with or in parallel to this interest. So some of the questions that come up is, should anybody even be allowed to mine in space? And if so, whom? For what purposes? So we have an interdisciplinary panel for you today. I'm going to introduce each and every one of them to you. So I'm going to start with Sophia Casanova, who is a geologist, and she is doing her PhD on mining on Mars. So she's going to kind of tell us why we're even talking about this, why we're even having this conversation. Next, we have two attorneys, two lawyers. We have Carolyn Throw, who works at the European Space Agency in procurement, but she was part of a Space Gen working group that worked on these very issues, and she's going to talk about some of their findings and recommendations. Next up is Chris Johnson, who's Space Law Advisor for Secure World Foundation. He's also is an adjunct professor at ISU, and he's a part of the Hague Space, let's see if I get this right, Hague Space Resource Governance Working Group. Kyla is also a part of that working group at The Hague, and he works for iSpace Europe, developing strategies. He's going to give us some of the industry perspective. And last but not least, we have Attia Matis. And he's got a very distinguished career, so I'm going to have to read a little bit about that. He has served our community for many years as head of the Space Publications and Registration Division of the ITU, the Radio Communications Bureau, Space Services Department. So we're going to hear a little bit about his perspectives as well. So we have a lot of ground to cover. We don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to open the floor to each of our panelists, who will briefly give us some of their point of view. I have a few questions that I'm going to, lob over the net for them, and they're going to share each of their perspectives on these couple of questions. I have a stopwatch, so I'm going to kind of herd the cats and keep us on track here, because we want to give you an opportunity also to ask some of your questions. And I know that we have some volunteers that are roving the audience with mics, so you just, when we get to that part and I say, hey, any questions from the floor, just let us know where you are, and we'll make that mic come to you. So with no further ado, here is Sophia Casanova.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you all for attending this session. I hope you find it informative and insightful. It's about space mining, so how can you not find it interesting? So, as Diane mentioned in her introduction, I'm a current PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales, which is in Sydney here in Australia. I'm among a group of students of differing disciplines at the university, each tackling very complex questions about how we mine and extract resources in space. My particular interest as a geologist is how we find and evaluate the resource potential of these deposits. Can we apply terrestrial oil and gas and mineral exploration principles to a non-terrestrial body, and how would we go about doing this? My particular focus is on Mars water resources, which can be used for future human missions, investigating buried glacial deposits, but as I'll discuss in a moment, there are a number of different bodies which are being considered for these type of operations and for different purposes. For today's discussion, I want to begin with opening what we mean by space mining, or another term that you may have heard, in situ resource utilisation, or ISRU, of which space mining is a subset. If any of you have attended the lunar or Mars exploration streams this week, and certainly some of the other GNF sessions, you would have heard ISRU mentioned. It of course refers to the extraction of resources from a non-terrestrial body, primarily at this stage at least for usage in space. And certainly what we're seeing is a growing acknowledgement that ISRU, the extraction or the mining of these local resources, will be a requirement for extended human missions and presence in space. Most certainly for Mars, but also for the Moon as well. And indeed, space mining will play a pivotal role in meeting the required needs for expanding space operations. To address this need, investigation into the technologies required to extract and utilise these resources is currently being undertaken, primarily for the extraction of water, which can be used for life support and propellant. In terms of where these mining operations will take place, a number of different approaches are being looked at. Near-Earth asteroids are a target of companies like Deep Space Industries and Planetary Resources. Water extracted from the lunar south poles is also being considered by others, with ice likely preserved in the surface or shallow subsurface within the permanently shadowed regions of the poles. And as well as Mars, where water exists in the form of hydrated minerals or water ice, is also being considered as a potential support for future human missions. To begin with, these operations will be relatively small in scale, which is important to remember. Think more water well rather than giant mine that you might be more akin to seeing here on Earth. And they will begin with exploration efforts conducted by robotic rovers to establish the resource potential. Ultimately, the chosen location for these operations will depend on the usage and resource requirements of the consumers, the quantity available at the chosen site, and the accessibility. In addition, as will be discussed by some of our other panellists here, meeting any legal or planetary protection requirements, and this will form an integral component of consideration of where, when, and how we can extract these resources. And this is an area that really needs to be developed with a collaborative approach between the differing stakeholders. Even if off-Earth mining is a while off, this forms a part of the discussion that needs to be happening now, as it's an intrinsic facet of all elements of the operation. Last week, the University of New South Wales Australian Centre for Space Engineering Research and the School of Mining Engineering co-hosted its third Off-Earth Mining Forum. And what was really interesting about this forum was how the mining industry and the space industries were coming together to tackle the complex problems posed by off-Earth mining. Although very different operations in very different environments, there are many lessons which can be shared between the two industries. What was certainly evident to me from the forum was the sophistication with which ISRU operations were being addressed, with detailed discussions about equipment design, mine planning, resource estimation techniques, and feasibility studies. Consideration is now being given to how we mitigate risk and uncertainty on large investment decisions based on limited scientific data, how to operate safely, and how we protect the environment from mining activities. These are factors that the terrestrial mining and oil and gas industries have been managing for a long time, and we certainly should be looking to them in how we apply their learnings as we move the economy into space. And finally, I'd also like to present the perspective of a member of the student and young professional community. What has been evident both at the forum last week and here at the IAC is the number of students in attendance and presenting their research on the topic of off-Earth mining, in particular from Australian students who seem to be really embracing this new area of research. There is a growing sense of excitement and anticipation among the student and young professional community. What I think is somewhat special about ISRU and off-Earth mining is the way in which it brings together so many different disciplines and expertise. We see engineers, scientists, lawyers, business and financial professionals coming together and working together to solve the many complex problems that lay ahead. And I think that's really exciting, which I think is a good note to end on. So I'll hand over to Kyla.
Thank you very much, Diane, for organizing this panel. So my name is Caroline, and indeed I work for the European Space Agency, but for this morning I will put my hat on of the SJC had, because I participated to the Space Generation Congress, which took place last week, and I was the proud moderator of the working group. I don't know. So I was the proud moderator of the Space Diplomacy Group, which dealt with the question of space resource governance. We were a team of 20 people. Sorry. We were a team, by the way, as we have the Secure World Foundation here as well, represented by Chris. A big thank you to them. They have sponsored our working group. Thank you to them. So we've been a group of 20 participants with various backgrounds, legally, engineers, but also policy, business, and as well in military. From very different countries, you can see it's 13 different nationalities were represented. And we have tackled this question during 3 days, and we came up with a few recommendations. The first point on which we agreed all, excuse me, was that we did agree that we want to find a way to support industry in the next steps for the space mining. So we thought that our first recommendation would be to say that we need to have a legal framework addressed at the international level to help industry, to support industry in the following steps. For us it was important that we would settle up at the United Nations guidelines. So we had a long conversation saying, do we need a new treaty addressing these questions, or are guidelines enough? Our conclusion was to say that we would go for guidelines because those guidelines are more flexible. We thought that the treaty would take time to be ratified, agreed on, all those definitions. A guideline would be, would allow more changes, modifications during the time. This is why we thought that those guidelines should be reviewed, rediscussed each year at the legal subcommittee of the UN Corpus. So this is our first recommendation. Then we went a bit deeper onto what type of questions we should tackle as well. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So we would have to tackle as well the question of the ownership of these resources. We know that there's the principle of non-appropriation in outer space of celestial bodies, but how is it about the resources, the mining that we could get? This was one first point. Then indeed we talked a lot about the possible partnerships or essential partnerships that should be built between the scientists and the commercial part, the industry part. How could that work? And we thought it's a very important point to be addressed as well in those guidelines to find the way forward. Finally, I would like to say that let's say that as the issue for us remains quite pressing, we thought that we would give this, or we would recommend this to the UN Corpus, saying that we need those guidelines now, so we would entitle or ask the UN to do so. However, we consider as well that we should, or we would need, on a more long term, a proper institution, a bit like the ITU. We have as well a representative of the ITU here in our panel today, addressing or framing the question. So who can, who can mine there, what, how much, etc. So to conclude all this, we really thought, or our working group is very much convinced and wants to support industry initiative, let's say, to give a legal framework, as we guess that the legal certainty will help them. Well, let's see what Kyla will say later, but would help them moving on. Thank you very much.
Well, Chris, take it away.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Chris Johnson, Space Law Advisor at the Secure World Foundation. So a lot of discussions this week and in the space community about space mining, the use of space resources, asteroid mining, celestial resource use. I don't think there's a whole lot of utility or purpose in saying and coming up with predictions like this is 5 years away, this is 10 years away, no, this is at least 20 years away. There's not much in having a definite opinion on it's definitely going to happen or it's definitely not going to happen. Because there is so much discussion, what is important to realize about that is it is now a political issue. It is now a geopolitical issue. It's now a diplomatic issue. It enters into the conversation between space lawyers, between experts in space policy. It is discussed at the United Nations level, both at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS in Vienna, and even informing and intersecting with discussions on disarmament in Geneva, these issues of use of resources in space. And because it now has a political component, we need to start talking about it. The next idea that I want to put into your head is about there's these ideas about using resources on the moon, using resources on asteroids, but this falls into a larger spectrum of new and emerging activities to do in outer space. We've heard presentations on on-orbit servicing. So this is satellites interacting, or spacecraft interacting with objects in space that may not be owned by that operator. The owner may be someone else. There's talk of active debris removal, ADR, capturing space debris, pieces of small debris, pieces of large debris. Again, this is activity outside of a state's territory where space actors are interacting with objects that don't necessarily belong to them. Now, moving a little bit further out and moving into this panel, this is using actors outside of their state's territory, interacting, possessing, trading in resources that don't necessarily belong to them. So it falls into this spectrum of how we look at the state of international space law and whether international space law is sufficient. The first question is, does international law allow this activity to happen? Or does international law prohibit this activity to happen? Or is, in fact, international law essentially silent on this activity? So in these discussions, you hear talk about Article 2, the prohibition on national appropriation. Please don't read Article 2 in exclusion to the great freedoms of Article 1 in the Outer Space Treaty. And in fact, the great purposes put in the preamble of the Outer Space Treaty and the language talking about inspired by the great prospects which open up before mankind. So look at the object and purpose of Article 1, look at the great freedoms of the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is the province of all mankind. So it is the activity of using and exploring, which is the province of all mankind. And then this appropriation, this prohibition on appropriation in Article 2. So when we look at all those things together and then we look at the things we want to do in space in the next decade, preceding decades, is the law sufficient? Is the law clear? Do we have the right space law? Do we have enough space law? And in order to save on time and really engage in conversation, the only other idea I'd like to put out there is the fact that we're hearing discussions this week and ongoing about things like a moon village, ideas about a deep space gateway, ideas about opening up cislunar space for economic activity. It seems fundamental and irrefutable that if we want to allow these next generation space activities, these next generation commercial but also scientific, crewed stations, installations, these activities cannot happen unless unless it is permissible under international law to interact with those space resources. So it means this. If you want to do a moon village, you implicitly admit that it is permissible to use space resources. I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to stand up. It's still early, so I want to get the blood flowing. My name is Kyla. I am from iSpace Europe, and iSpace Europe is in Luxembourg. And today I'm gonna rewind this back. So I'm going to talk about perspectives, then I'm going to talk about politics, and then at the end, because I'm not a lawyer, I'll talk a little bit about law and what that means to us. So iSpace, is not a space mining company. iSpace is a space exploration company. Now, why do we say that? I think most people understand that space mining, or the word mining itself, doesn't have a very good sound these days. There's a lot of negative connotations with the word mining. So we're a space exploration company. iSpace is based in Japan. The headquarters is there, and we are participating in the Google Lunar X Prize. We're one of the 5 remaining teams that's there. But from the beginning, we were international. So we have an office not only in Japan, but also at NASA Ames and in Luxembourg. And in each of these places, we have missions. We're building specific missions for specific countries using their technology. And that's something that we want to continue to do, because we really do believe that if we're going to be doing any sort of exploration activities in space, the whole world should be a part of it. But how do you become a mining company? I can tell you right now, if you start up a mining company for space and you only focus on mining, you're going to fail. Why? Because space mining is still a decade away at least. So right now, we're actually a media company. We put logos on our first rover that's going to be sent to the moon before March 31st of 2018 from popular companies that you may know, like Suzuki or JAL, KDDI, and we sold those sponsorship for $10 million. Now that is going to pay for our first mission. And our first couple missions, we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to work with sponsors to help us to pay for these missions, because we're a startup and we're not using government money. So first off, we're a media company. Next, we're a transportation company. So we want to be that provider to people who want to send their payloads to the moon. Now those payloads can be commercial payloads. Most of you know Gatorade, but some of you might know Pocari Sweat. Pocari Sweat is like the Gatorade of Japan. And one thing they want to send to the moon is a little powder, so that when astronauts arrive at the moon, they can mix that powder with water, and then they have a refreshing drink. So that's one of the things that they're doing to help build their brand. The other things that we're going to send are instruments, scientific instruments. You can imagine a greenhouse, a small greenhouse, where the first seed is growing on the moon. Or scientific instruments like spectrometers that are going to help us to do what all the space agencies want right now. It's more information about the resources. So it's really difficult for us to do space mining right now, because actually, and for some people this is hard to believe, we actually still don't know what sort of resources exist on the moon. We've done orbital satellites that give them some information, but we still have not been down into the permanently shadowed regions. There's big arguments about if there is actual ice there, how it's distributed. Is it hard, like a rock, or is it soft? Is it distributed equally, or is it more heterogeneous? So people are asking still, what does this look like? So the second thing we're going to be a transportation company, so we figure that out. And then we're going to be a data company. And we're going to sell that data to space agencies and mining companies who are interested in doing it. And third or fourth, finally, we might be a space mining company. And even then, we will be a junior exploration company, because we're still small. And in the mining industry, there's 2 types of companies. There's a junior and there's a senior. Juniors does the prospecting. Seniors are the big companies like Rio Tinto who come in there and actually do the mining. So you can see that there's growth that needs to happen, step by step by step. Now, space is political. It's a very, very political arena. And we're trying to operate that in an international way. So we're participating in many different working groups to better understand how can we share the benefits of space resources. And for us, this is not monetarily necessarily. There's many ways that you can share the benefits of space. And I'll give you one example. Our laboratory, the Space Robotics Laboratory, was first focused on building microsatellites. That's the first thing we did in Japan. And we sent many of those microsatellites back into space. What we did after that is we took different countries, students from different countries, from the Philippines and from Vietnam. They came to our laboratory and we taught them how to build satellites. Just last year, those students from the Philippines went back to the Philippines. They built their own satellite. They sent that satellite to space, and now that satellite is providing remote sensing data that's helping them to to mitigate disasters. Vietnam is going to do the exact same thing. So that's technology sharing. That's benefit sharing. That's not necessarily monetarily sharing. And that's one thing that we try to explain to people, that benefit sharing can be distributed in many different ways. But when some people understand Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty as, well, you're not allowed to appropriate, but you have to share everything, including potentially the profits that we make from space mining, that's going to be a really hard business case for us to bring back to our investors. So lastly, I want to talk about the law that we think is important for us right now at the beginning. And that's what I will call a safety zone. When we're operating on the lunar surface, what we're asking for is an area around us where we can operate without interference from other companies or agencies or players on the lunar surface. And this is because the lunar environment has regolith everywhere, and if you land within 50 kilometers of us, that's going to really disturb our operations. And we want to provide that opportunity to other people as well. So when we're talking about legal frameworks that need to be built, if there's too much too early, that will strangle us and we won't be able to grow. But if there's nothing at all, there's no trust. And that's something that we want to avoid. So we're continuously working with the international community to make something that's somewhere in the middle. And we hope to continue this dialogue in the future. We really understand that this is going to be an international conversation. And I'm really excited to see all the people that are here today, because we really need a lot of input. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning. I understand from the speakers and generally the lawyers dealing with the outer space and now the space mining that there is a big expectation from the regulatory and the engineering part, or the space engineering part, to help with the space mining. And I can tell you, or we can guarantee as a regulatory engineers from Orbit Spectrum size, that we have a good news for you, or a good message, that practically everything which is related to the space mining, practically everything is fixed. So I'm going to show you in some slides how it can be done. First, the ITU Constitution is already talking about space mining indirectly, because when we speak about that the ITU is allocating frequency bands, orbit spectrum resources for the space services, everybody was talking before about the GSO orbit, but if you look carefully in the ITU Constitution, we say also other satellite orbits, and other satellites orbits can be whatever in the solar system or even beyond the solar system. It's not only the geostationary orbit, but with a big red message that all these rules are directing towards avoiding harmful interference. So the first message to the space mining community is that we would like to know about you, that you would like to do these activities, because there are other services, as you will see later, using the bands, and the biggest message is you would like to finish your mission, others would like to finish their mission, so it's necessary to avoid harmful interference between the radio or satellite systems. How to do it? It's quite easy. We say always, just follow the ITU radio regulations, because the radio regulations, in fact, you have no other choice. ITU radio regulations is a legal and binding intergovernmental treaty, and it's all member states, they have to follow the orbit spectrum resources, which the rules which are related to orbit spectrum resources, with all the rights, but people are not very happy to also to say that there are also obligations, not only rights, but also the obligations when they are using orbit spectrum resources. And the most important thing from the radio regulation is frequencies and services. The Article 5, the frequency allocation table, is the core part which is telling you, if I wish to use these frequency bands, I can use these services, or opposite, if I have these services, which frequency bands I can use. And this is the absolutely critical thing. And the second is, there are also regulatory procedures which are telling how to use the bands. There are the coordination procedures and the notification procedures. And I have immediately good news for you that all frequency bands and services which are related to deep space is not subject to coordination, so you follow the advanced publication and after then straight the notification process. But again, it's an absolutely must to obtain the proper recording in the master register, to have an international recognition and protection from the harmful interference. If we look to the definition a little bit deeper, in fact the radio regulation is preparing the, from the regulatory point, the space mining, because okay, we have the space operation service which is for tracking, telemetry and command, but if we look to the Article 5, especially the space operation service is expected to use for satellites orbiting Earth, or let's say for the missions to the moon, because if we look deeper, the deep space definition in the radio regulation is starting from 2 billion kilometers, so only the deep space is defined in the radio regulation. We have even definition of the deep space to help for the mining. So all activities beyond the moon is considered as a deep space activities. And if you look to the service which is the closest today to the space mining, is the space research service. The only problem today is, which can have to be fixed in the future, is if you read the definition of the space research, it's the space used for scientific and technological research. There is no one word today about the commercial use of space research frequency bands. So this is message for you when you go home, and if you are serious in the space mining, in the commercial, not research, but on the commercial use, after then the studies have to start soon after World Radio Conference 19, because I did mention that the radio regulations are changed, only can be changed by the World Radio Communication Conferences. So if you feel that it's a right time to go even deeper as the space research service in the deep space, after then the studies have to come to make a better definition what is the space mining using deep space, etc., etc. We have even frequency bands for the deep space, so there is nothing new. If you look to Rosetta and other missions of the space agencies, they are using the S-band, which is, there are frequency bands for the deep space, or they use the X-band, or they keep the Ka, upper part of the Ka in the 30 gigahertz band. Then we have even the permits of the Earth stations, etc., etc. So this last slide is showing you the references from where you can dig deeper space space, digging for the information which is free. You can download the radio regulation in 6 languages. We have even the Space Research Service handbook, free of charge, downloadable, and ITR recommendations, how to operate which services, especially in the deep space operation. So this is all from the first round, and we'll see the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, panelists. So I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm sure each of you have obviously had many conversations about ISRU or space mining. So what is your go-to response when somebody tells you that these activities are not permitted under the Outer Space Treaty, completely illegal, can't be done, the bane of our existence, defiling the pristine environment of space? What do you say? So I'm going to open that up, and if you could give us your brief response, your go-to answer from your point of view, we'd really appreciate that, and feel free to speak among yourselves. So if you have something to say, Kyle, to something that Caroline or Sophia has to say, then step right in.
All right, so from my perspective, I'll leave it to some of our lawyers in the group to go into the legal specifics. But what I find really encouraging is these type of discussions. So we're considering what the problems are and where there are limitations. As I mentioned in my talk, there is that growing acknowledgement that if we do want to go to space and do these big grand plans that we have, that we need ISRU and we need mining. So really working with what is established at the moment and what needs to occur in the future in order for us to be able to operate in this environment, and not only in terms of the question of legality of whether we can or not extract, but also in the deeper operational frameworks and guidelines as well, and how we operate. Mining on Earth, very much these regulations and guidelines are present there, and we need to be considering what they would be in space, because it impacts all the different facets, right from exploration, right from the start, through operation and development, and right through to closure. So these are the aspects that we need to work on, and I think collaborative discussions like these is where we start.
So in other words, focus on the good that's going to come, sort of like the shared benefits that Kyle was talking about a little bit, instead of focusing on what can't be done, but why we want to do these things. Okay.
Well, I think from a legal point of view, what we can say is that indeed the Space Treaty did not allow this type of activities, but there's nothing mentioned saying that it's prohibited. So I think it's a matter of interpretation. We have to keep in mind that the Outer Space Treaty, as we all know, is a 50 years old document, legal document, which is of course applicable and that we have to respect. But I think well, in my opinion, in my legal opinion, I would say that there is space for interpretation, and somehow we have to follow as well the trends and the technical innovation to go forward.
All right, so I would say, if you are engaged in a conversation in the space community with someone who, you're from the space community and someone outside of it, or someone who says that these activities are illegal, or they're very concerned, and there's a lot of anxiety and trepidation about whether these things are permissible, what it opens up, what it sets a precedence for. I would say, answer number one, if you're dealing with someone who's not a lawyer, say there's something that exists called the Lotus Principle, and the Lotus Principle is presumptions upon the sovereignty of states is not presumed. It's not automatic, and that which is not explicitly prohibited is therefore permitted. This was announced as a general principle of international law, that if there is no law prohibiting an activity, then because states are sovereign, they can go ahead and do that activity. And that if you look to the Outer Space Treaty, it is not There's no phrase which is directly valid and on point which says that we are not allowed to do these things. Therefore, it is permitted. Then, if you're dealing with someone who does deeply know international law and may have a rejoinder to assertions of the Lotus Principle, which has been, frankly, undercut in certain areas of international law, I would say that as a compromise position, the starting talking point is that we can at least look to the Outer Space Treaty, looking at Article 2 and Article 1 and the preamble with the object and purpose, and say that we're dealing with a treaty on principles of 17 short articles. A treaty on principles, a framework treaty that doesn't have all the answers, and that's known. It doesn't address asteroid mining, just like it doesn't address lunar resource mining, or space debris salvage, or on-orbit servicing, or manufacturing in space. It simply does not address those things. And you know, go from there, that these things are not directly addressed. And that space law is an open system. We know that space law is an open system because the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was followed by the Astronaut Rescue and Return Agreement of 1968, which expanded upon Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty. The Liability Convention of 1972 expanded upon Articles 6 and 7. The Registration Convention of 1975 expanded upon Article 8 dealing with registration. So space law is an open system, subject and therefore subject to expansion and refinement and clarification. And so we may need new laws, new regulations, new frameworks to do these next generation activities in space. I want to say that we can say that within our lifetimes there may be new international frameworks, new laws dealing with space debris, dealing with on-orbit servicing, dealing with salvage, dealing with lunar rights, asteroid rights. We may need new law and new frameworks for that. And so I should mention, again, the Hague Space Resource Governance Working Group, which has developed building blocks, kind of a menu for what legislators on the international level or the national level could use to inform those discussions. Additionally, we're looking at these activities at the legal subcommittee of COPUS, which has now an agenda item, possible legal models for the exploration, use, and utilization of space resources. Then two small things on the policy level is that I cannot imagine a national space law, national space legislation, which prohibits its citizens from mining resources. That's one point. The other one is, on the policy perspective, as I said before, when we look at these things we want to do in space, these next generation space activities, if we cannot use resources in space, this, to my mind, essentially stalls or forecloses or makes those activities very complex and maybe cancels our plans for those activities unless we can use resources. So, two policy arguments, and that's all.
Maybe I can just build upon that, Chris. Was it Lotus Principle? I think he just mentioned. I think that's an American principle because, and I'll tell you why. I think it's maybe a Western thinking that, well, if it doesn't say we can't do it, then we can do it. But in Japan, it's a little bit different. Actually, in Japanese law, if it's not explicitly said that you can do it, that means you can't do it. So this is where it comes back to the perspectives and how law is interpreted. This is what I understand from some of the Japanese people that I've spoken to before. Therefore, these ideas need to be approached from many different angles. I'm not a lawyer myself, so I'm not going to get into the details. I think there's a lot of people talking about this, more than is potentially necessary, in my opinion. And why? There are things like, let's think about drones, okay? Technology in drones is growing so rapidly right now that the lawyers are chasing behind them. The same in AI. Tons of things going on and the lawyers are chasing. But somehow in space mining, when we're still years and years and years away, there are 25,000 lawyers talking to us about what we can and cannot do. And that's because people are concerned. And you know who's the most concerned? It's really interesting. It's kids. I really, really like doing public speaking at schools. And when I talk about what we're doing about lunar exploration and lunar mining, Chris and I actually were speaking together in Israel. And the children were really concerned, you know? And it came back to something that you mentioned, Diane, about the pristine environment of the moon. And this is something that we take very, very seriously. And just to acknowledge the fact that we don't intend to strip mine the entire moon. And when we go to the moon, and you imagine mining these days, there are not going to be these 30-ton massive dump trucks with 300-meter high long walls drilling into the moon. That's not what it's going to look like. There are already huge changes happening in the mining industry. One of them is in situ resource utilization, where they're actually using chemicals that they pump into the soil that dissolve the minerals that are necessary, and you can bring them up just like that. I'm telling you, we're not going to bring tons and tons of things to space. That just doesn't make economic sense. And when we do go to space, we do intend to leave areas on the moon for scientists, for research, for exploration, for play. We want to have national parks, let's call them, on the lunar surface, which are open to all the time. But we do need areas that we can operate in. And those areas might be a little bit difficult to get to. And as there's not too many of them, it can be really competitive. So that's, I think, what's really important when we're talking about legal policies. How do we prevent problems from happening in these competitive, high-value property areas on the lunar surface?
Thank you, Kyle. I think what I'm hearing you say is that your response is we intend to behave responsibly. So the legality, maybe some of these anxieties and these concerns can be assuaged by a little bit more knowledge about the kind of activities that Sophia is researching and that you are kind of programmatically attempting to accomplish. And Attila, briefly, because we'd like to open this up.
Just quickly to react to my predecessor, that now, not as an orbit spectrum engineer, but as a citizen, I am a little bit scared what he told that, oh, we are going not to mine like 50 years ago, we will push something and to make an extraction of whatever underground. I am scared that what will be the impact, how we know what is under the ground. So this is just the comment. But to come back to the subject for which I am here, we are facilitating the things, so I'm sending you a clear message. Space mining to the moon, there are frequencies, services without any problem. Deep space, it's possible also today, and it's done through the space agencies' missions. For the commercial part, I technically don't see again the problem, but there are two things which are very important, where the responsibilities of the commercial space mining companies will be not only the rights to use the frequencies and go somewhere to the deep space, but also the obligation to build a control ground system. And if you look to the deep space network of all space agencies, if the space agencies will say, we don't want to cooperate with the commercial space mining, if somebody has to build for the commercial deep space activities a ground segment, I am just warning you that this may cost more as the mission somewhere, because it's a deep $100 million to create a global deep space ground network which will control and operate the space mining rockets somewhere in the deep space. But this is an obligation from the radio regulations.
I have a response though. Right before our panel, there was a panel talking about global partnerships. And so I would offer to you that perhaps that's a way to accomplish those goals and not have to create a whole other network, a deep space network for the commercial. So we'd like to open up the floor to questions from all of you. So if you have a question, could you let us know and we'll get the microphone to you? Thank you.
My question probably relates more to salvage and collection of space junk. But do the rights of salvage, as known in the laws of the sea, apply in any way to that?
So we often, I mean, sometimes people look to analogous regimes in international law, what lessons can be learned from law of the sea or from aviation law, cyber law, law of armed conflict. But that, I mean, those things can be useful and insightful, but essentially there's no law of salvage in space. States retain the ownership of their launched space objects. And this is, again, an example of the limited nature, the modest nature of space law, that we don't have laws, again, either really permitting it or prohibiting it. We simply don't have real clarity for salvage in space. And that's the thing we may need in the coming years.
Hi, this question is for Sophia and Kyle. So Sophia, from the perspective of the Australian Space Agency, the new one, and Kyle from the perspective of Japan and Luxembourg, what sorts of assistance do you want from these space agencies, and what would be the most effective and helpful legislation for you right now?
So from an Australian student perspective, certainly assistance with research would be our main request for the present time. And there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of enthusiasm, as I mentioned. So how we can really bring in the Australian students who for a long time have found it difficult to see their pathway into space. And I think the Australian Space Agency has that ability to facilitate and keep that knowledge in the country.
Thank you very much for that question, Danielle. There's two things that I think space agencies can do, and some of them are actually happening already, especially in America. NASA is very forward-thinking with their approach to commercialization of space. They've created a number of programs what startups can work in to help them to develop and then eventually actually serve NASA. So it's well known that commercial industry can do things relatively cheaper than space agencies. And so when we're talking about transportation, this is something that we would like to provide to NASA. So let's use an example that some of you may know, Resource Prospector. It's a rover being developed by NASA, priced at about $350 million dollars. What we're saying is, why don't you let us do that? We can send up your instruments for an order of magnitude less. You're going to be taking a little bit more risk, but you're going to be allowing us to grow in the meantime. Another thing that I can do, and this is that I would like space agencies to consider, is purchasing data from us. Now, for the scientific community, this is something that they're not used to. They're not used to purchasing data. Scientific data has always been free. But if space agencies can buy data from us, that will help us, again, to monetize and continue to do missions. From a legal perspective as well, Danielle, I'd just say that this idea of a safety zone, again, is really important to us. When the Google Lunar X Prize, one of the teams was specifically saying that they wanted to visit Apollo. And what NASA said is, well, please be careful, because we don't want you to land on top of the Armstrong's footprint. So please stay away from that zone. Stay at least 50 kilometers away from that zone. And this is where this idea of a safety zone comes into play. And this is something that, again, we think legally would really help us to continue to grow as a company.
I have a question, if I may. Magdalena Hoffman from University of Luxembourg. I have a question to Attila Matas. Attila, thank you very much for explaining us the applicability of radio regulations to the missions on the moon, the space mining missions. Did I understand you well that the operators on the moon have to apply the radio regulations, or they may apply radio regulations? Thank you.
They have to apply, because today I didn't go deep on it, because there are also in the radio regulation, when we go to the data elements, reference bodies. So the radio regulation is even talking about the satellite orbiting Moon, or satellite orbiting Mars, or satellite orbiting Venus. And I fully appreciate your point that there is one weak point, that today we have 3 regions. Region 1 is Europe, Africa, Region 2 Americas, Region 3 is the Asia Pacific. So the frequency allocation table is dealing with the Earth's orbit spectrum resources. But probably this is for you to come with the initiatives. We can have a region 4, which will be the Moon and other celestial bodies, or even deep in space, where probably, let's say today we use the 100 megahertz band everywhere in the world for FM broadcasting. But I am sure that on the Moon or the Mars, nobody is interested to have 20 megahertz wide FM broadcasting bands. So today it's prohibited because this band is used for broadcasting purposes. But if we create a region 4 for a deep space, can fix these items, the allocation table again shall, must, to apply also to others, but let's say with the creation of region 4 for...
Hello? I just want to ask a really quick question. I'm up here. Thank you so much for having this discussion. I teach lots of children who are also concerned. I just want to talk about one of the important things that they think about. We understand that commercialization wants to monetize their companies, and coupled with specific interpretations from any lawyer, it's very much afraid of not only having mining, but we don't want Samsung plastered across the moon, or Suzuki when we look through our telescopes. So all of these companies that are paying for you to put robots and rovers on the moon, we understand the commercialization, the children understand the commercialization, and we do need a balance. We do need all of those lawyers to say, okay, at what point do we not have advertising plasters across our moon?
I saw another hand over here, and I think we have time for maybe one more question. So is the person over here still want to ask your question? Yes? Do we have a microphone for this person? No? Okay, well I think that we've run out of our time anyway, so I want to thank you all for your attention and your good questions, and I want to thank my panelists for their information and their provocative answers to my question, and have a lovely rest of conference. Thank you.